It makes a lot of sense for someone to disappear when they walk 200 yards out onto the frozen Lake Michigan in the middle of winter. It doesn't make a lot of sense for them to reappear 700 miles away and 14 and a half months later on their aunt's doorstep. Hi, my name is Mateo, and welcome to Tater Does True Crime. Before we get into the story that this video is about, I do want to say a very special thank you to Ellen Killeran. She wrote a Substacks article about this case that was immensely helpful when I began researching all of this. Obviously, I did my due diligence and I did look at other sources as well when I was looking into this, but without that piece, I really wouldn't have known where to start with everything. So I do just want to say thank you to her, and I am going to link that article down in the description just in case this video interests you. There is a whole lot more there for you to read about this. Stephen Kubacki was a 23-year-old student at Hope College in Michigan. Hope College was traditionally considered a little bit more conservative. It was a Christian college, and specifically Stephen Kubacki was described by his peers as a little bit more free-spirited compared to everyone else there. He only had one semester left on his degree. Most of the sources I saw said that he was intending on majoring in history, although his own personal website said that he ended up getting his major in German after all the events of this story, just because, as he himself said, he swapped majors about 12 times while he was at college, which, fair enough, me too, and I still haven't even graduated. Stephen Kubacki was very physically active. He was an avid cross-country skier and runner. A lot of the reports I saw said that he ran about 6 miles a day on average, which is insane. That is psychopath behavior, if you ask me. And all of the sources I saw said that he had at least one girlfriend in Germany. A couple of them said that he had multiple girlfriends in Germany and an additional one even in France. I'm not here to speculate on the character of Stephen Kubacki or how many girlfriends he did or didn't have. I do just want to state that he did at least have a significant other overseas. The last thing I wanted to bring up in just giving you the general idea of who Stephen Kubacki was that one of his peers, when interviewed after all of this went down, said that Stephen Kubacki was a real Dungeons and Dragons kind of guy. Which I hope he didn't mean that as an insult, because I would get my feelings hurt. The story that we're here to talk about starts on February 18th of 1978. That Saturday evening, Stephen told his roommate Mark that he was heading out for a cross-country skiing trip, just a short little one-day trek. Their apartment was about 6 miles from the shore of Lake Michigan, so he was just going to ride down to the shore of Lake Michigan and then come back up later that evening. Stephen left with a backpack and his skiing supplies, and Mark wasn't particularly worried when Stephen didn't return that evening. Stephen had said that he was traveling to Saugatuck, and there was a very real chance that he had gone out later that evening or he had stayed out at a friend's house. But when Stephen still hadn't returned Saturday afternoon, Mark began to worry and he got in contact with the authorities. The police, in classic 80s police fashion, told Mark that they didn't want to investigate. Stephen was a 23-year-old man, he had the right to go missing, and there was no need to assume that anything bad had befallen Stephen out on a cross-country skiing trip in the winter. However, there was a slightly lucky break in the case when a pair of snowboarders going along the shore of Lake Michigan found Stephen Kubacki's possessions laying on the shore. The snowboarders found Stephen's skis placed about 8 inches apart, as if he had been riding up there and taken them off. His backpack was set neatly between them, and his ski poles were stuck into the snow. So everything that they found there seemed as if he had set it there with every intention of returning to get it. It didn't seem like he left in a panic. He just set all of his things there. Police then began searching about a 3-mile radius around where Stephen's belongings had been found. This included out onto the ice of Lake Michigan, as well as out onto the shore around his belongings. Stephen's roommate would later say that he had been known to just enjoy walking out onto the lake. He just thought that that was a fun place to wander around, and police did find evidence of that. The only trace of Stephen they found, besides his belongings sitting on the shoreline, was a single set of footsteps leading out onto the ice of Lake Michigan. I do want to take a moment to say that I didn't grow up around any of the Great Lakes, and so I didn't realize just how treacherous the ice on Lake Michigan could be in the winter. I was envisioning just a nice, smooth, serene, crystal glass lake, but Lake Michigan is so big it has its own waves under the ice, and so the ice breaks apart very often and can open up into chasms into the water and then close back up really quickly. And so when Stephen's footprints just disappeared 200 yards out onto the lake, it seemed like the explanation was pretty straightforward. Now, when I say that his footprints went out 200 yards onto the lake and then they just vanished, that is exactly what I mean, and that is a lot of why this case is so puzzling. There was no evidence of him walking out that far and turning around. There was no return footsteps, obviously, and there was no other trace of somebody else going out onto the ice with him. It was as if Stephen had walked out 200 yards and fallen through a crack in the ice, or been plucked up by an eagle, or anything to that nature. I don't actually know if an eagle can carry a human, but that was the biggest bird I could think of that could pluck Stephen up off the ice. Stephen was never declared dead by his family or by the law system after all of this went down. He was awarded an honorary degree from Hope College. In absentia, he received his history degree. And although many news sources seem to report that there wasn't a very active search following his disappearance, a few sources that I saw suggested that it was a very active search for up to a year after everything went down. The search included scent dogs, snowmobiles, helicopters, and even a plane, and they really did try to find this guy, although the conclusion seemed pretty cut and dry. Police didn't suspect foul play. There was nobody else who'd gone out onto the ice with Stephen, judging by the footprints, and it just seemed like he had walked out there, the ice had opened up underneath him, and Stephen was perished. On a slight side note, police did send Stephen's dental records to Chicago just to see if he could be matched up with any of the missing victims of John Wayne Gacy, although this seems like less of an indication of Stephen's disappearance and more of an indication that they were just trying to solve the John Wayne Gacy murders, and any missing male in America was maybe considered as a possibility for John Wayne Gacy to have taken. Stephen Kubacki's family also didn't give up hope on finding them. His brother hired a detective from an agency called the Fat Man Detective Services, which I think is just about one of the best detective agency names I've ever seen. But that private investigator was unable to dig up anything else besides the logical conclusion of the fate of Stephen Kubacki. The only other clue that was really dug up during this initial investigation was a sighting of a man who resembled Stephen Kubacki's description on the shore with a girl about his age taking photos, not long after he had gone missing, on the same afternoon as the search began. Now, I didn't see any record of an interview with this girl or who this girl was, but there was a police interview with a woman whose name had been redacted from the record, and from the snippets I saw of that, it maybe could have been the girl from the shore. She was a student at Hope College as well. She was very distraught that Stephen had gone missing, and she disappeared about 3 weeks later and moved out of state. So, is it possible that Stephen Kubacki was seen with this anonymous, redacted name girl right after his disappearance and they ran away together? Maybe. I can't attest to that. There's so little evidence of that, but I did want to bring up that there was a sighting that maybe was him after the disappearance. Now, if this is where the books had been closed on this case, I think that everyone on Earth would agree that Stephen Kubacki had walked out onto the ice, fallen through it, and was never seen again. There's really no reason to suspect anything else. Except that 14 and a half months later, his aunt received a knock on her front door, and when she opened it, it was Stephen Kubacki. His aunt was living in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, about 700 miles from where Stephen had gone missing, and when she answered the door, she very logically asked, "Where have you been?" To which Stephen Kubacki had absolutely no answer. Stephen claimed that he was suffering from full amnesia, absolutely no recollection of any moment in time between when he had gone missing 14 months ago and the exact moment that he woke up on a grassy knoll in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and hitchhiked over to his aunt's. His direct quote about this was, "I was lying on the grass in a meadow. When I woke up, I didn't know where I was, and I was wearing clothes that weren't mine." That is the most information he could give about that. Stephen said that he was confused when he returned home because his parents were very excited to see their son return from the dead, and there was a lot of hugging and kissing, and he didn't really understand why all of that was happening because to him, he'd only been missing for a day. He did state that the last thing that he could recall was darkness, cold, and the fear of being lost out on the ice. So it does seem like he walked out onto the ice and remembered everything up until that point, and then just blinked and woke up on that field in Pittsfield. Now, when I said he returned to his family, there was a bit of unfortunate news when Stephen reawoke, because his mother and father had become divorced in the time since he had gone missing. So he went and saw his father, then went and saw his mother, and that probably wasn't the best news that he received that day, although I think that if you return from the dead, a win is a win. The thing that I found most odd about Stephen Kubacki immediately after he reappeared is that he had no interest in investigating or finding out where he had been during this time. He saw a doctor for a general physical exam just to make sure there wasn't anything egregiously wrong with him after his 14 months of being completely off the face of the earth, but he refused to see a psychiatrist, and he didn't really cooperate with investigators trying to find out where he had been either. So, without a lot of information to go off of there, and with Stephen not really caring to find out where he had been, what exactly happened? What do we have to go off of here? Well, when Stephen woke up, he said there was a backpack next to him, and he assumes that that backpack was his. So in that backpack and on his person, he had a small collection of items that maybe have some clue as to his whereabouts during this time. Stephen found on his person a shirt from a Wisconsin marathon, along with shoes that would fit running in a marathon. He found maps of California that seemed like local maps of individual roads and stuff that you would get in a gas station in California. He had hitchhiking signs that suggested hitchhiking in locations such as Sacramento, San Francisco, Reno, Chicago, and Utah, which is a pretty big spread of the United States. And he had about $40 in cash on his person. With all of this stuff, the logical conclusion that you would draw is that he had been in the locations that his signs suggested, primarily out on the West Coast, and then had somehow returned home. It is worth noting in regards to the marathon shirt that the only marathon held in Wisconsin during the time that Stephen Kubacki was missing was the Pavo Nurmi Marathon, in which there was no evidence of him ever having registered. I'm not saying that it's completely impossible that he ran in that marathon, but in order to get a shirt from that marathon, you would have had to have registered your name, and if he used his real name, it wasn't on there. He very well could have used a fake one. He did report upon waking up that it felt he had ran a great while. I don't know how you wake up and know that you felt like you've run a really long ways. Maybe his legs were very sore. But if you want to give that any more credit to the marathon situation, then give the credit that you think is due. The only other clue that arose when Stephen reappeared was an interview that police did with the motorist who picked him up and gave him a ride from that grassy knoll in Pittsfield over to his aunt's home in Great Barrington. The motorist said that Stephen had told him his name was Nathan, and he had told the motorist that the aunt he was being dropped off at was actually just one of his friends. So this is after Stephen has awoken and regained memory of who he was, but he's still lying to this stranger about his identity, which I do think is odd. It could very well just be, don't give your information to strangers, and I wouldn't judge him for that, but I wanted to bring that up at the very least. So what theories do we have as to where Stephen went? We can start with Stephen's own theory that he came up with right after his reappearance, which is that he had suffered from a form of memory loss that is common to be suffered by mountain climbers, which is induced by cold and exposure and low body heat and a lack of oxygen at altitude sometimes, where mountain climbers just will suffer periods of amnesia and have no recollection of the events up on the mountains. Now, if Stephen had walked out onto the lake and then maybe spent a day or two out in the Michigan cold and then returned home, I might be willing to lend a little bit of credence to this theory. However, assuming that the items he had in his backpack are accurate and he was in California, I highly doubt that that temporary fit of amnesia lasted for him all the way through going to Utah, Sacramento, Reno, all the way back out to Massachusetts. I don't put a lot of weight in that. It is worth noting, this was only his theory at the time. Remember, he had very little interest in discussing what had gone on, and this was probably something he just said to get people off of his back. Stephen Kubacki is still alive, obviously, and in researching for this story, I did find that he was writing a book about his disappearance called The Disappearance. He is currently approaching publishers with this book, as far as I could tell on his own personal website, and in this book, it does say that he is going to come forward and tell everything that had happened to him while he was gone, his full explanation. Now, I don't want to call Stephen Kubacki a liar, but either you had no memory of what happened for those 14 months, and therefore you wouldn't be able to write a book on it, and you'd be lying in your book, or you remembered what happened on those 14 months in the moment, you lied and said you didn't remember it then, and now you're writing a book on it now. Do I want to call Stephen Kubacki a liar? Not necessarily, but I do think it's at the very least a little bit odd that now he feels like he can come out and publish a book about everything that happened during his time away. However, I'm excited to see that book come out and read it and see if his explanations there make a lot of sense. Maybe he's just going to solve the whole mystery, and I'm just kind of speculating while I have the time to. Now, our second theory on all of this is sort of two theories wrapped up into one, which I'm going to call anything that is not supernatural. So the two options here are that Stephen either went into a fugue state and just completely dissociated from reality for 14 months and just sort of got lucky stumbling through life with no money, hitchhiking around the country without ever being in a proper mental state, which I don't necessarily believe, and I don't think that a fugue state really would be lasting for that long, most likely. Or the other explanation is that Stephen Kubacki engineered his own disappearance. Stephen Kubacki engineering his own disappearance would make a lot of sense in the regards that he could have been lying about his memory loss, which could also play into him writing a book about it now. He went missing on purpose, didn't want to admit that to anybody in the moment, but now down the road he wants to come clean about going missing on purpose, and so he's going to publish that book. There are a few points that I think contradict this theory, the most prevalent of those being the footsteps that led out onto the ice. I think that it's a very grandiose plan for him to have very deliberately walked out onto the ice and then maybe stepped into his own footsteps on the way back in order to leave no trace of his return, in order to stage his disappearance as him falling through the ice of Lake Michigan. It's possible. I have no idea what mental state Stephen Kubacki was in at this time, but I do think that that's a stretch as far as staging your own disappearance. There is also the fact that I do think this would be unbelievably cruel to his family. I know that people go missing on purpose somewhat frequently, but without a very strong reason to, it seems very odd to me that he would stage his own disappearance in a way that would make people assume that he was dead. I have a hard time believing that. It could have not been an issue to him, but I don't necessarily buy that. And one other point that has been brought up is that Stephen's roommate Mark said that if Stephen went missing on purpose, Mark was positive he would have been told about this. Now, Mark doesn't know everything, and it's very possible Stephen just didn't tell him, but I think that it is worth noting that it seems like the two of them were very close, and Mark believes that if Stephen was planning on intentionally disappearing, he would have just said, "Hey Mark, love you man, it's been real, see you never." So that is another point against the intentional disappearance theory. Now, if you want to believe that Stephen Kubacki went missing on purpose, I don't blame you at all. I do think that it is probably the most logical explanation, but for the sake of having a fun video, let's look at some other reasons that Stephen Kubacki might have been gone. I want to start with two supernatural theories that I think make absolutely no sense. One of them is that Bigfoot kidnapped Stephen Kubacki, and the other is that a skinwalker took him away. Now, if a skinwalker took him away, Stephen Kubacki's not returning home 14 months later. Whether you believe in skinwalkers or not, you do know that according to skinwalker lore, if they catch you, you're going in their stomach. You're not going to your aunt's house in Massachusetts. And as far as Bigfoot, Bigfoot's whole thing is big feet, big footsteps. There was one set of tracks. I don't ever want to say that a theory for a disappearance is dumb, but of all the things that you could attribute to being Bigfoot, this is the one that has the least probability of being Bigfoot. Now, one supernatural theory that maybe has a little bit more grounds to stand on is anything related to the Michigan Lake Triangle. Michigan Lake Triangle stretches from Ludington to Manitowoc to Benton Harbor, and it is named after the Bermuda Triangle because there's a history of similar disappearances in here. A couple that I noted was just a lot of boats going down in the lake, which boats do sink, but it was a lot of boats going down and no trace of them ever being found, them going down in very fair weather, things like that. These boat disappearances go as far back as 1679, as well as a lot of plane disappearances, including one Flight 2501 that I found was very odd. In 1950, this plane went down over the Michigan Lake Triangle in a crack of flashing light, and then no full debris was ever recovered of this plane. All they ever found was little partial chunks of debris and body parts like ears that were found out among them. So that's weird. If you want to attribute that to supernatural things, some people do. There's also a history of alien sightings in this area, notably one as recently as within like 5 years of Stephen disappearing. But a lot of people say that whatever strange forces are out in the Michigan Lake Triangle could be responsible for Stephen's disappearance. Something like a UFO floating overhead and scooping him up with a tractor beam does explain pretty much all of Stephen's disappearance. His footprints go out, they stop abruptly because he was sucked into the air, and then once the aliens were done experimenting on him, they dropped him out in Pittsfield, and they were just so polite as to drop him out within a short hitchhike of his aunt's home so that he could resume his normal life. The same thing would go for him walking into a Fey portal or getting kidnapped by lake spirits or anything like that. They do offer a technical explanation that does fit the disappearance, but it seems a lot like you're just sort of molding some sort of supernatural thing that just sort of fits with it. However, if that's what you want to buy into, I respect it completely because I don't really know if I buy into the natural explanations for this disappearance either. So, whatever you think happened to Stephen Kubacki, please let me know. If there's any theories about this case that you think are really strong, I would love to hear them because, like I said, I'm not particularly attached to him engineering his own disappearance. It seems like this whole lake scene that he set up would be a lot of work when in the 1970s and 1980s, you could kind of just move to a new town and say, my name's John, and everybody's going to say, cool, you're a new person named John, and it's not that hard to disappear. So I would love to hear your theories. I would also love to hear any comments or critiques you have on this video, because this is my first true crime video that I'm putting up. I just want to start this and see if it goes anywhere. If there's something I can do to make this more enjoyable to watch, I would love to hear it. That being said, I really appreciate your time. If you do like it, go ahead and subscribe because it helps me get this whole thing off the ground. And that's about all I have to talk about with the disappearance of Stephen Kubacki. Bye.